Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, one of the most oppressively politically correct campuses in a nation full of politically correct campuses. In 2016, he was, perhaps reluctantly, thrust into the spotlight as an iconic anti-social justice figurehead when he stated that he would not use non-binary pronouns such as je or other similar fad words concocted by PC crybullies. This was part of a larger discussion by Peterson on his objections to the Canadian legislation that includes gender identity and expression as new protected categories in the criminal code. For his efforts, he found himself surrounded and attacked by overtly hostile students and operatives. He spoke publicly while protesters chanted, hurled insults, and tried to drown him out. All this happened with a complicit school administration in the background, and while the entirety of the Canadian academic establishment, save for Janice Fiamingo, whistled and looked the other way. And there is no doubting Peterson's bravery and steadfast adherence to his beliefs. For that, he has subsequently and quite impressively been rewarded by free speech supporters. For my money, Peterson has earned that support and the respect that comes with it, which makes it all the more ironic that I would be doing a video addressing his recent references to men going their own way as weasels. Rather than just quote or paraphrase here, let's look and listen to what he had to say.
Well, here's the decomposition of the fundamental archetype. The dragon of chaos differentiates, on the one hand, into the feminine, that's the unknown, and the feminine differentiates further into the negative feminine and the positive feminine. The negative feminine is the reason for witch hunts. It's the reason for, you know, there's a whole group online called Men Going Their Own Way, Mgtow. That's a very interesting group to go study. There's lots of them. I don't know how many of them there are, and most of them are older. Many of them are men who've been through a particularly horrifying divorce for one reason or another, and they've had enough of women. So they tell the young men that they're teaching, never have a permanent relationship, never share your territory with a woman, never share your possessions, make sure you never live together, and don't stay with one long enough to enter a common law relationship because you will be stripped of everything that you have. Well, that's a hell of a thing to be telling people, but what's happened is that the female has been manifested in their life only as the negative archetype, and they've got that confused with all women. And that's partly, you know, you got to ask yourself, if you know the mythological stories, maybe if you made the right sacrifices you wouldn't have so much trouble with women. It's a good question to ask yourself first. And I would also say, you know, if you're a woman who has trouble with men, or you're a man who has trouble with women, it's not the women and it's not the men, it's you. Because the women are telling you what's wrong with you, and the men are telling you what's wrong with you. And if you don't listen, then it's you. It's either you or all men. Well, that's easy, it's all men. Well, that's certainly how it's played out in the world right now. It's like, no, it's not all men. You can be by definition. And it's not all women, that's for sure. I don't want to have anything to do with women. It's like you're a pathetic weasel. That's the same statement.
Okay, now that was quite a mouthful for a 2-minute clip, and it included a surprising amount of fail given Peterson's obvious intelligence. So let's take a good portion of his remarks, one short bit at a time, and try to sort out his line of thinking.
Well, here's the decomposition of the fundamental archetype. The dragon of chaos differentiates, on the one hand, into the feminine, that's the unknown, and the feminine differentiates further into the negative feminine and the positive feminine. The negative feminine is the reason for witch hunts.
Okay, so far, we're good. Personally, I love the use of archetypes and narratology in explaining the modern psychodrama playing out between men and women. I find all of it very useful, provided you have the creative ability to structure new narratives and imagine new archetypes. This alone only increased my interest in Peterson's work, which only made it more disappointing as Peterson takes this good start and goes rapidly into bad fiction.
There's a whole group online called Men Going Their Own Way, Mgtow. That's a very interesting group to go study. There's lots of them. I don't know how many of them there are, and most of them are older. Many of them are men who've been through a particularly horrifying divorce for one reason or another.
And this is what we call creating your own facts, which is a pretty big shot in your own foot if you've just given the impression that you studied this subject. Peterson has no clue, none, about the age demographics of Mgtow. Neither does anyone else, because no one has ever, despite Peterson's claims about himself, done any kind of study. It's never happened. We don't know if Mgtow are mostly older or mostly younger, or if it's a more even age distribution. We don't know if Mgtow are mostly divorced or mostly married. We certainly don't know that Mgtow is characterized by older men teaching younger men. It's my guess, since almost all of this is conducted online, that age does not figure into the dynamic in the same way it would in real-life settings. What I've witnessed over my last 10 years of online involvement in this counterculture is something much more akin to peers sharing experience and ideas with each other, irrespective of age. But always, when speaking to these guessing games, I must remain aware that we are dealing in conjecture. I can't state any of this with certainty, and neither can Jordan Peterson. For instance, I've talked with a good number of Mgtow that started following this path because of what they saw happen to their fathers, because they were raised by single mothers who demonstrated the same propensity for destructive control and abuse that is reported by Mgtow men of their former wives. I could forgive a layperson who employed such casual use of the word study, and even for taking cursory examinations of a subject and then overreaching the implications of those examinations and applying them to a much broader, unstudied group of people. But Jordan Peterson isn't a layperson. He is a much respected and accomplished scholar. Either that, or he's just one more bit of proof that where it regards the humanities, accomplished scholar is an oxymoron. Let's move on.
And they've had enough of women. So they tell the young men that they're teaching, never have a permanent relationship. Never share your territory with a woman. Never share your possessions. Make sure you never live together, and don't stay with one long enough to enter a common law relationship, because you will be stripped of everything that you have.
And? Okay, I'll do my best here to avoid descending into a tirade of snark and condescension. I really do appreciate Peterson's work, but I really must call this academically dressed up NAWALT out for what it is. A thoughtless, myopic oversimplification of an unavoidable social phenomenon. Peterson no more studied Mgtow than he studied organic chemistry. And here he paints a dark, sadly telling picture of the brutal reality of modern psychology, a field of study charged with plumbing the depths of the human condition, unfortunately riddled with lazy, emotionally driven academicians and practitioners whose ability for sound reason has a life expectancy measurable in seconds the moment they step into the realm of sexual politics. Does Peterson really imagine that advocates of Mgtow don't know that there are, in fact, marriages and other relationships that don't end in unmitigated disaster? Now, are there men who identify as Mgtow who believe the line as presented by Peterson? That every woman on the planet is, without exception, on the prowl for gullible, well-meaning men calculating when they can abscond with the man's progeny and financial assets? Sure, there are some, as there are some similar outliers in every social movement. But in casting that hyperbolic net over the entirety of Mgtow, which in my experience is much more about reasoned risk management than personal projection, Peterson finds himself in the same company as the knee-jerk ideologues that catapulted him into the public eye by mischaracterizing his position and painting it as something pathological and pernicious. And besides, the point here is that men and women who blame entire classes of people for their problems are found in and out of all groups, including Mgtow and feminism. They constitute a group or subgroup of their own. They don't, as should be obvious, defined anything but themselves. If you think I'm being unfair to Peterson, let's listen to more.
And that's partly, you got to ask yourself, if you know the mythological stories, maybe if you made the right sacrifices, you wouldn't have so much trouble with women.
I suppose that this is a good time as any to point out that some of the more extreme voices in Mgtow, the ones that fit Peterson's broad brush caricature of the entire movement, did go through life-wrecking divorces. These men that I have spoken with over the past 10 years, with some exceptions, were hard-working, loving fathers and husbands who were ripped apart from their children, their assets, and often their freedom in a family court system that represents the biggest rollback of civil rights since Jim Crow. They stepped up to the plate like men, like this society has always told men to step up, and they caught a fastball between the eyes. I don't think Jordan Peterson, or anyone else for that matter, has the moral authority to be making such smug judgments about what these men have sacrificed. I have no more to say on that.
It's a good question to ask yourself first. And I would also say, if you're a woman who has trouble with men, or you're a man who has trouble with women, it's not the women and it's not the men, it's you. Because the women are telling you what's wrong with you, and the men are telling you what's wrong with you.
Oh, really? That's how it's done? I seem to recall crowds bordering on hordes of both men and women beating pots and shouting over Peterson, sometimes with bullhorns, about everything they thought was wrong with him. Were they right? How about the accusation that he supports Nazis? Is that something he should listen to and take in? How on earth is what he is saying any different than something as bloody inane as "listen to the woman," which is now repeated like a mantra at campuses everywhere, instructing young men to suspend their own critical thought and their own lived experience to embrace whatever ideologically motivated women are telling them? For the record, Dr. Peterson, should you be listening, this kind of admonition, delivered in the scolding, shame-inflicting tone of an irate librarian, is just as much a driving force behind the growing phenomenon we know as Mgtow, as the family courts and the increasingly entitled culture of women. Let's move on.
It's either you or all men. Well, that's easy, it's all men. Well, that's certainly how it's played out in the world right now.
Yeah, no shit. And it stuns me that with Dr. Peterson aware of the prevailing narrative, men as the problem, that he could not simply add 2 and 2 and find another of the complicated factors driving a movement of men to check out and go their own way. And alas, in all fairness, this is one of the pitfalls of standard, run-of-the-mill, blue pill mentality. To see and not see. To look at something and believe in all earnestness that you're making an objective study when the truth is that you cannot see what is directly in front of your eyes. To be unaware that you are unaware. Psychologists are no more immune to this than anyone else. Perhaps, coming from the insulated and thought-squelching halls of academe, they are even more susceptible to this malady of thought. Peterson might have come to different conclusions if he had actually studied Mgtow without stale convention filtering the results. Then again, reading a few blog posts and putting it all in a convenient box he could live with was probably the real culprit. Either way, it led him to a conclusion that literally put him, at least for the moment, a step or two closer to the same ideological thugs that have worked so hard to silence his voice.
No, it's not all men. You can be by definition, and it's not all women, that's for sure. I don't want to have anything to do with women. It's like you're a pathetic weasel.
Dr. Peterson, with all respect, I suggest you reevaluate your position here, your statements, your ideas, and your claims. I've admired your work, but I have to say that in this particular situation, I think you need some correction on just who is being a weasel. And that concludes another Talk from an Ear for Men. I do hope you've enjoyed. I'd like to remind you that if you enjoy the work I do on this channel, there's a link in the low bar to my Patreon page, as well as to one-time donations and monthly subscriptions. Your support makes it possible for me to continue to dedicate time and effort to providing you with information and perspectives you won't hear anywhere else. As always, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to like and share the videos on social media, and to remember that feminism is cancer. See you next time.